Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter of the Book of Lamentations. The Book of Lamentations, the authorship is attributed to Jeremiah, who is also the author of a book which bears his name, classified as prophetic, which bears 52 chapters. This book is 5 chapters, and if the 52 chapters of the book which bears his name describe the decline of Judah. He preached for 40 years and he witnessed the deterioration, the inexorable deterioration of his beloved Judah in Jerusalem all the way to captivity. Lamentations takes place. If Jeremiah takes place during the decline, Lamentations takes place during the deluge when there is nothing left. The independent sovereign nation of Judah is no more. They have been captured and captivated by the Babylonians, who left only the poorest people behind. So the land of Judah was essentially a desert wasteland and a ghost town. And Jeremiah is rightly called the weeping prophet. He wept over the condition of his beloved nation and city, and his tears become more acute when that city is abandoned in a ghost town. And we just want to read a quotation from Diane Burgat, author of Lamentations. "There is no attempt to hide the horror of the destruction that the people experienced. The reader is invited to ground zero of the devastation, there to stand dumbfounded by the enormity of the collapse of this once great city." So even recently, this city was once flourishing, it was once proud, it was once populous, it was once a commercial center, flourishing commercially, deteriorating spiritually, but it was a force to be reckoned with. It had a beautiful temple, which was laid desolate as the result of the Babylonian conquerors, and Jeremiah, who was intensely patriotic, as were every prophet. They only wanted the best for their nation, and he dared to suggest to the king Zedekiah that he surrender to the Babylonians in the interest of sparing the temple. His advice was interpreted as treason, and he found himself in the dungeon, but much of what we read of here could have been avoided if only they took the prophet of Yahweh seriously. So the opening verse reads, "How alone she sits, the city once great with people. Like a widow she has become, once great among the nations, a princess amongst provinces, has become a slave." So this is a sharp deterioration. Only a few years ago, it was a independent nation. It was certainly in the decline, but it boasted aesthetically beautiful city with walls and temples and houses that were not desolate. It is now reduced to ghost town, and she is the nations are referred to in the feminine form, just as we speak of America as she and hers. So too would any other culture, this one being Judah, would have spoken their nation in a maternal light. And the city was once populous. It was once a thriving capital city of a proud nation who had been reduced to a widow with no family because it was a ghost town. And she was formerly great, but her greatness was no more. It was no more in sight. And she who had once been a princess among the provinces had been reduced to a slave. So they had no one to blame for themselves. This was the consequences of the covenant, which was really a two-way street. Blessings and prosperity for obedience, cursings and judgments for disobedience. In Jeremiah, for 40 years of his ministry, he continually preached repentance, and by the worldly measure, he was not a successful minister, but by the divine measure, he faithfully communicated the message which was endowed on him from the Ruach Kadesh and from Yahweh on high, faithfully and accurately. So the fault that he did not attract mass audiences cannot be the blame cannot be placed square on his shoulders. It is wholly on the audience. They had itching ears. There was no shortage of false prophets, which he had to contend with. These were the ones that the kings and the authorities gravitated to. Why? Because they told them what they wanted to hear, whereas Jeremiah took the more unpopular course of action to tell them what they need to know, and they didn't like hearing what they need to know. And once more, as I already mentioned, he found himself in prison on sedition and treason for daring to suggest that the city was doomed, whereas the false prophets prophesied a message of peace, that no harm would come to the covenant nation, but their prophecies were invalidated quickly by the reality. She weeps bitterly at night, and her tears are upon her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no comfort for her. All her friends have betrayed her. So Jeremiah is, as we already mentioned, likened to the weeping prophet. He experienced bitter lamentations. That is the book of this nation. A lamentation is a sincere expression of grief, and this is defining it. And one thing we should have mentioned before we covered this is that each chapter, all the way up to the fourth one, are arranged in acrostic, which is a literary device where there are 22 verses in all of the chapters except for the third, which consists of 66, which is divisible by 3. So each word begins with a letter in the Hebrew alphabet. There are other examples of this literary device, such as Psalms 119, which consists of 176 verses. It is the single longest chapter in the Bible, and there are 8. It's arranged in sections of 8, each of which begin in the alphabetical order. The words of each verse begin with the word of the Hebrew alphabet in the order where they appear. And so 8 by 22 is 176. And we have to remember that vowels were categorically excluded from the Hebrew written language. And another example of this is Psalm 145, which consists of 21 verses, but 13b is the next acrostic. So in that sense, it is 22. So any number divisible by 22, odds are that it is an acrostic. And Jeremiah was weeping, and he had tears, but the tears and the weeping were not limited to him alone. The entire city was in a state of desolation and ruin. They had little cause to rejoice, and the tears were all over their cheek. And among her lovers and friends, those who had been her allies. So there were 3 illusions that the Judeans stubbornly clung to all the way to the end till they were invalidated. One was that the Davidic dynasty would reign in perpetuity. They would not be displaced from the promised land. And I forget there are other 2, which, I forget them. We're just going to move on. And Judah has gone into exile because of afflictions and because of harsh labor. She has dwelt amongst Gentiles. She has found no rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her between narrow places. Now, the pursuer were the Babylonian conquerors. They were the dominant geopolitical entity in the ancient Near East at that time. And they took Judah, they transplanted the native Judaisms and concentrated them in their capital city of Babylon to keep them on a tight leash. And they did utilize the services of Daniel especially, who served in the functional equivalent capacity as a prime minister, first to Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian, then Cyrus the Persian king, who displaced the Babylonian conquerors, and he was a liberator of the Jewish people. Nevertheless, Daniel stayed behind because he could influence the king to have leverage to protect his people. and they're dwelling amongst Gentiles, and they have no rest because they had a land of rest in milk and honey, and these being surrounded in a worldly pagan culture would have been a site for restlessness for these Jews. The ways of Zion mourn, for no one comes to the appointed times. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh, her maidens are afflicted, and she has bitterness. So there were 3 appointed holidays, those being Passover, Pentecost, and the one other. I should really know this, but those were the ones in Deuteronomy 16 where they were commanded. Yom Kippur was the other one, where every Jew was commanded to gravitate to Jerusalem as the center city, where they would be united for those festivals to celebrate them in tandem. But what happens when Jerusalem is a ghost town and there's no temple, there's no possibility for these traditions to continue, at least in their present state. And Zion was it still existed, the Mount Zion, but what no longer existed on it was the temple, which was razed to the ground, a fate which Jeremiah, had the king prudently accepted his advice to surrender without resistance, he could have spared the magnificent temple of Solomon, but because he had neglected the counsel, it laid in ruins along with the city itself. But the whole predicament could have been avoided if they had trusted in Yahweh's anointed prophet. And her gates were deserted. It was a de-walled city. The walls wouldn't be constructed until 445, when Nehemiah burst onto the scene. And bitterness is their state of being and state of mind, because they have nothing to rejoice or be happy about. What was once a flourishing city was now a ghost town, and the covenant nation was no more and no more united than they were. Her adversaries had become chief, her enemies had become at ease. For Yahweh has afflicted her because of her many transgressions. Her children have gone into captivity before the enemy. Now, why would Yahweh do this to his chosen people? Is because they had an arrangement, a covenant, which was a treaty dictating terms. Now, there are lowercase covenants in the ancient Near East. This is where a stronger party would initiate the terms governing their relationship to a weaker party. And of course, there is no superior force than Yahweh, the creator, controller, maker of heaven and earth. So the Mosaic covenant was a capital C one, and there were consequences for disobedience, which they had no one to blame for themselves for being in, and their enemies were in comfort. They had ransacked their city, and Yahweh had afflicted her because of her many transgressions. This was not a single, isolated, or individual. It was a society-wide endemic of a culture of covenant violators, and the children, through no fault of their own, would be carried into captivity because of the sins of their father. What do we read of in the Decalogue? That Yahweh visits the iniquity of the fathers unto the 3rd and 4th generation. So the children, some of them may have been born in Jerusalem, but they wouldn't have been raised there. They would be raised in the foreign land of Babylon. And all the splendor has departed from the daughter of Zion. Her rulers have become like a buck. They found no pasture, and they go powerless before the pursuer. So they are to the complete mercy of the pursuer, which once again, we've read that word before. That would have been Babylon, who chased them out of their home. They came in waves, the first of which was 605 BM before Messiah, the second of which was 597. Then in 586, they fully conquered and razed the walls, the city, and the temple to the ground, leaving it an uninhabitable wasteland. and Jeremiah would be transplanted to Egypt in the year 581 BM, but he did spend 5 years after the conquest in this ghost town. And the splendor, all the glory and majesty of the once prominent city had departed. It was no more, and it would not return to the restoration, largely the works of Ezra and Nehemiah. And, their rulers were shepherds, and any ecclesiastical or secular leader in Jewish history was likened to a shepherd, and as such they existed to provide, protect, and preserve the flock of their nation, but they had led them astray. There was a lack of leadership, and when there's a lack of leadership, it trickles down to the lower echelons of society. So this wasn't just the priests who were guarded and entrusted to enforce the Mosaic law were derelict in their duties and had not neglected the task which they had been entrusted to enforce. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembered all her pleasantries she had in the day of old, when her people fell into the hand of the enemy, with no one to help her. The adversary saw her. They mocked at her destruction. So all they had was the memory of the once prosperous and successful and flourishing city. That was a faint and distant memory. You could never tell looking at the city, which laid in desolation and ruins at this moment in time, that it was once a flourishing city, but many of those who remained at least had the memory of what once was, and what it was right now was clearly not what it should be, but they had no one to blame for herself, and that's because they fell into the hand of the enemy being the Babylons, who had overwhelmed them and conquered her. They had trusted in alliance with Egypt. Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon were the three rival contenders for geopolitical supremacy in the ancient Near East, but Babylon conquered Assyria in 612 BM, Egypt in 598 BM, and Judah in 586 BM. So there was no one to help them at this point, and the adversaries, they were pointing and laughing and mocking at their destruction, which they had caused. Jerusalem has sinned greatly, therefore she has become defiled, and all who esteem her despised her, because they have seen her nakedness. She herself has sighed and tuned away. Now, nakedness is a source of shame. It's been that way ever since the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were formerly in their pristine, innocent state. They were naked and not ashamed. Then once they fell, they tried to cover their nakedness. They grew a conscience and a self-awareness that their nakedness was a source of shame, and that compelled them to construct fig leaves, and Yahweh mercifully slayed a rabbit to cover their genitals and private parts in the ways that the measly fig leaves could not. Her uncleanliness is in her skin. She did not keep in mind her latter end, and has gone down appallingly. There is no one to comfort her. See, O Yahweh, my affliction, for the enemy has made himself great. So he was afflicted, and rightly so. Now Jeremiah did not merit this punishment. He was the righteous remnant. He was the one who boldly spoke the truth despite of the consequences, and regardless of the affliction and adversity that would be visited upon him. And Yahweh could see his affliction. He's calling on him to see him, to take notice, and to have pity on him, because the sad fact is that the righteous remnant had to suffer because of the sins of the immoral majority. and the enemy has made himself great. They had conquered and swallowed every nation which lay in their path, and that was just the way, that's the way of the world. The stronger military might prevails. The adversary has spread his hand over all her pleasantries. Indeed, she has seen. The Gentiles have entered her temple. To those who commanded not to enter your assembly. So nothing was off limits. The Babylonians did not. They desecrated what the Jews considered something significantly sacred. And so once they had entered into their city, they tore the temple down. They razed it to ruins. Again, this predicament could have been avoided had Jeremiah's wise counsel been heeded, but tragically it was neglected when he offered it, because there was the false prophets who told the kings and the authorities what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. And Jeremiah was punished for telling the painful truth, which subjected him to libelous charges of treason, when in fact he was a patriot and a covenant keeper, and he knew what was best and wanted what was best for his people, but the people didn't want him, even though he wanted what was best for him. They could not tolerate the suggestion, and lo and behold, in his own lifetime, soon enough, the imminence of his prophetic fulfillments would fall upon them almost immediately. And all her people are sighing, seeking bread, for they have given their pleasantries for food, to bring back life. See, O Yahweh, and look, for I have become despised. So Jeremiah was despised. He was he never lived a comfortable life. He never had wealth. He never had prestige. He never had popularity. This was the price of the prophet. Of course, the false prophets were flourishing financially and socially and socioeconomically, but Jeremiah was willing to pay the price of the prophet, which the the false prophets did not count the cost, and they were unwilling, and the authenticity of their message was dubious at best. But we're actually going to close on the 11th verse. That's halfway through the 22nd chapter. We cannot possibly fit it into a 30-minute format. We will pick this up sometime soon, but that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.